inside his own family. What answer does Genesis 7:1 give to the question, how did Noah get the wild animals into the ark? What's the spiritual application of this? You see, Noah had quite a job on his hand. Oh, people have wondered, about that. They were in the ark for a year and 17 days. Now, what about those wild animals? Well, some people say the animals weren't wild yet. They weren't fierce yet. And that's why he could keep the elephant, the lion, and the tiger, and all the others in the ark. Now, I don't accept that. I think it's clear, when did the animals become fierce? When man sinned. Because God said, let us make man in our image and let him have dominion. And man did not have that complete dominion after the fall into sin. The animals became fierce. Susan asked me one time if I were in a den with a lion, who would have the dominion? Well, you say the lion would have the dominion, therefore I wouldn't get in the den along with the lion. But when man sinned, he lost that. And I think it's very clear the elephant was fierce. The lion and the tiger and all these other animals were fierce. How'd you get them in the ark? And then how'd you keep them in there for over a year? Well, now listen to Genesis 7:1. I heard a baccalaureate message on this years ago. Usually I don't remember many baccalaureate messages. People are so busy graduating that the sermon is just there because it's supposed to be there. And you're not supposed to get much out of it. That's what I've gotten out of most of these baccalaureates. But this was great. Genesis 7:1, God said, come thou and all thy house into the ark. He didn't say go. He said come. God was already there. In figure, he entered the ark first. Of course, since he's everywhere at one time, he was already in the ark. And then by his mighty power, he drew those wild animals into the ark. Now you see, what's the spiritual application of this? How are you going to get those unsaved friends of yours, those unsaved loved ones into the ark? What did Noah do? Did Noah make a great deal of plans to get them in the ark? No, Noah obeyed God. He believed God and he obeyed God, and God took care of the animals. What's your responsibility to bring the members of your family to the Lord? I don't know how many of you have mothers who aren't Christians and fathers who aren't Christians. Wouldn't it be wonderful to win your own mother to Christ, to win your own father to Christ? What's your responsibility? To trust the Lord and to obey the Lord. Now don't expect God to save them in spite of you. Don't expect that you get mad and lose your temper and you're stingy and selfish and cross all the time and that sort of thing. Then if you don't live for Jesus before them, don't expect the Lord to save them in spite of you. But if you trust the Lord and obey the Lord, you can trust God to use the same power that drew those wild animals into the ark, to draw your unsaved loved ones to Christ, to draw your unsaved friends to Christ. The Bible says that Noah was righteous and perfect. Righteous means he was right with God. You know, our English word righteous is the shortened form, the euphonious form, good sounding form of right wise. Righteous, right wise. And to be righteous means to be right wise, to wise as to that which is right. And Noah was right with God. And then it says he was perfect. That doesn't mean he was wholly without sin. But it means he was completely on God's side. He didn't sit up on the fence and be afraid to get on God's side or go back on the world's side. He wasn't a fence straddler. No, he was completely on God's side. That's the meaning of that word perfect is used here. And because he was righteous and fully on God's side, he could trust the Lord to work the miracle and get those wild animals in the ark and then keep them there over that period of a year and 17 days. On page 15, we come to Noah's ark as a type of Christ. Definition of a type. Now later, when we study Exodus and Leviticus, we'll study about the ark of the covenant, which is very different from Noah's ark. When my dad and I were in Palestine in 1934, we had a small party, group of people, but one was a preacher. I won't tell you what his denomination was, except that he wasn't a Baptist and he wasn't a Presbyterian. I'll tell you that much. But he came to me and asked the question, and then his wife asked my dad the same question. He said, the Bible says Noah's Ark rested on Mount Ararat. And we came to a place, Kirjath Jearim. Says this is where the ark rested. And that meant the ark, this shaped like a throne, the symbol of God's throne, wood overlaid with gold. I said, the ark rested here. And the preacher said, Frank, how'd they get that ark all the way from Mount Ararat over here? And the man's wife asked Dad the same question, the preacher and his wife. Evidently they didn't know anything about the Ark of the Covenant in the book of Exodus. But here's the ark, and it's a great picture, a great type of Christ. As the word is technically used, a type is a divinely planned prophetic illustration. Express this definition in your own words, or deal with it in any other way deemed helpful to aid you in a clear understanding of a type. Now, I want to add one thing to this definition to make it more complete. A type is a divinely planned prophetic illustration. And then shoot a little arrow from this somewhere and write this in with a present tense realization. With a present tense realization. Now, here's a little diagram that I use to keep this before our minds. A type is an illustration. But a type is more than an illustration. A type is a divinely planned or God-ordained illustration. Now here's the way I illustrate that. Just an arrow that's coming down from the sovereign God to us. It's a divinely planned illustration. In other words, technically, if I call something a type, I don't just mean that I see an illustration in it. More than that, I'm saying that God meant it to illustrate that. That it's a divinely planned, God-ordained illustration. And then it is a prophetic illustration. It points forward to the future. But it's a prophetic illustration pointing forward to the future. Watch. With the arrow coming back to the man himself. With a present tense realization. Now here's what I mean. Noah's Ark is a type of Christ. And you say, this points forward to Christ who's going to come. Right. But was Noah saved right then? Noah was in that physical ark. Was he also in Jesus Christ, the ark of safety? Indeed he was. See, there was a present tense realization. And that present tense realization is very important in order to get the full force of the ark. A student said an interesting thing to me many years ago when I was teaching the Old Testament. He said, when you have this view that I call the horizontal view of dispensations, it means that you don't really have as many types as the dispensationalists, the verticalists have. I think that's true. Because I stress the fact that Noah was in Christ right then. He wasn't just in that physical ark that pointed forward to Christ, but there was a present tense realization of it all. And that's true as you go all the way through the Old Testament. Notice this, when you have your types, the general rule is that the attitude that somebody has towards a type of Christ shows the attitude he has towards Christ. The attitude he has towards a type of Christ shows the attitude that he has towards Christ. For example, Saul tried to kill David. Why did he have that wrong attitude to David? Because he had the wrong attitude to Christ. David was a type of Christ, the beloved king. And he was a type of Christ, the beloved king, and Saul's attitude to him was what it was because of Saul's attitude to Christ, who was typified by David. What is the chief way in which Noah's Ark is a type of Christ? What's the chief way in which the ark typifies Christ? Mention any details which help to emphasize the one central message. Now that's important when you have a type. The type is like a parable in the New Testament. It has one central teaching, and the details have significance only in relation to that one central teaching. The type has one central teaching, and the details have significance only in relation to that one central teaching. Now, of course, the greatest type of Christ in the Old Testament is not a person. The greatest type of Christ in the Old Testament is the tabernacle, and later the temple that took the place of the tabernacle. That's the greatest type. But many people give lectures on the tabernacle, and they spend so much time on the little details that they miss the main way in which the tabernacle is a type of Christ. Well, those details can be very important if they're related to the one central teaching. Now, what's the one central teaching of the ark as a type of Christ? It's a type of Christ as our refuge from the judgment of God. See, the flood was God's judgment, and the ark was a type of Christ as our refuge from the judgment of God. Now take your details, and take your details in terms of that one great central teaching. There was only one ark. There's only one refuge from the judgment of God. Everybody outside the ark was destroyed by the judgment of God. Everybody out of Christ will suffer the judgment of God through all eternity. Only one ark. Only one refuge from the judgment of God. Only one. Oh, I just wonder, looking out on this group, how many from this group are someday going to be on the mission field to tell the heathen about Christ when they've never heard of Christ for the first time? I'm glad you fellows enjoy your basketball, but I hope you won't think of the school primarily in terms of basketball. But this is a Christian school, and we long to have Christ in the very center of everything. And with all our imperfections, don't forget the fact that's the one thing we are aiming at. And pray for us in that, because we long to have Christ in the center. And we long to have young people go forth from this school, go on and finish their education in the will of God, and then preach in this country, preach overseas, wherever God calls them, and to spread the gospel to those who've never heard. There's only one ark, only one refuge from the judgment of God. Then the ark was a perfect refuge. Perfect refuge. See, the illustration of that is it was watertight. God says, thou shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. Why did he have him pitch it within and without with pitch? To make it watertight. And you see, when they were in the ark, while it was raining for 40 days and 40 nights, not a drop of water touched those who were inside the ark. It was a perfect refuge. Here's a very interesting thing in the Hebrew language. In the Hebrew language, the same word that's translated pitch is also used for atonement. And some just render it here in terms of the type. Shall pitch it within and without with atonement. Well, you see, that wasn't what he said. Oh, he said thou shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. But you see why it's related. Why did they take the same word for pitch and apply it to the atoning blood of Christ? Because the atoning blood of Christ saves me completely from the judgment of God. Saves you completely from the judgment of God. Now, when you take the ark as a type of Christ, don't forget this. Oftentimes we spend so much time talking about how safe they were when they were in the ark that we forget one of the main points. Why were they safe inside the ark? Because the ark bore the brunt of the judgment. The ark bore the brunt of the judgment. Just imagine now, it's raining, the windows of heaven are open for 40 days and 40 nights, and they come down on the ark. And then in addition, the fountains of the great deep are opened up. The rivers and the oceans, the seas are loosed upon the earth, and the water in the bowels of the earth, the wells, is brought forth on the earth. I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a minute and just try to visualize this. Try to visualize with your eyes closed the rain coming as the windows of heaven are open for 40 days and 40 nights, beating down on the ark. And then the fountains of the great deep are broken up. The waters and the oceans and seas and rivers and the bowels of the earth loosed upon the earth. And all that time the ark's bearing the brunt of the judgment. Now open your eyes. What'd you see? You saw Calvary. That's what happened at Calvary. When Jesus died on the cross and cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? All the windows of heaven of God's judgment were poured out upon Christ. And the fountains of the great deep were loosened. And that's just a picture of what happened. When you talk about the ark, don't forget that the ark bore the brunt of the judgment. And Christ bore the brunt of God's judgment upon sin. There's a very famous evangelistic song. D.L. Moody and his song leader Sankey took it around the world with them in evangelistic endeavors. There were 99 that safely lay in the shelter of the fold, but one sheep was out and on the fields of night far off from the gates, from the shepherd's fold. But none knew how deep were the waters crossed, or how dark was the night that the Lord passed through. Here he found his sheep that was lost. And one time I just asked myself the question, how dark was the night that the Lord passed through where he found his sheep that was lost? How deep were those waters? The dark night was far darker than the nights of the flood, when the rain descended for 40 days and 40 nights. Far deeper than those waters of the flood, when the waters went 22.5 feet above the top of the highest mountain. Far deeper than that. And you see, the ark is just a wonderful picture of what Christ did for you and for me. I know I'm not going to hell. I wonder how many of you can say you know you aren't going to hell. Oh, may God grant that not one person here will go to hell, and more than that, that every one of us in this room will know that he or she is not going to hell. Because Christ took my judgment on the cross. Christ took your judgment when he died for you on the cross. So the central message of the ark is Christ is our refuge from the judgment of God. And remember, when you come to study the types, be sure that you take your details in terms of the one central teaching. Because otherwise you can make a type mean almost anything. Just as in the New Testament you can make a parable mean almost anything if you don't get the one great central teaching. From your reading of the above-mentioned definition of a type and your study of Noah's Ark as a type of Christ, mention any values of typology which you find. A student asked me one time, a grad student, he said, you say this is a type. What's the value of having a type anyway? What's the value? You see, some people who teach college students try to get away from anything that seems fanciful. And so the student was just asking, well, what's the value of having a type? Let me mention 4 values of the types. The first is they are God-ordained illustrations. They are divine illustrations, God-ordained illustrations. I love to use illustrations. You know, some people actually think it's spiritual not to use any illustrations. If you don't use any illustrations, you aren't Christ-like in preaching, because Christ used illustrations. Take those parables were really illustrations. What they sometimes mean is don't use a lot of certain kinds of illustrations. Well, that may be true. But I love illustrations. D.L. Moody, the great evangelist, said he'd walk 20 miles for a good illustration. And that's one reason God used him so. He got illustrations that brought the truth down where people were interested. They could listen to it. They could understand what he was saying. Illustration lets the light in. But you know, I like to use illustrations, but I can't claim that my illustrations are God-ordained illustrations unless they come right out of the Bible. But types are God-ordained illustrations. Therefore, if you're not sure that something is a type, then call it an illustration or a picture. I had an illustration of this many years ago. One of my students was in a church in Columbia, and it came to something where he was teaching a Sunday school class, and he said, "This is a type." And the person said, "I just don't understand that about types." And he just said, "Well, will you accept it as a picture or as an illustration?" He said, "Yeah, take it as that." Well, you see, when you're saying it's a picture, you're not saying it's God ordained as that. Now, when you go to train people more in the things of God, you use the word type in a technical way. But one thing that woke me up on that was my dad. Dad would hear a preacher preach on something as a type, and he'd say, "Son, I think he's guessing. I just think that preacher's guessing." He never accused my pastor, Dr. King, of that. He never accused Dr. King of guessing. And Dr. King didn't take the types like that, in that wild kind of way. And, you know, some say, "This is a type." Often I'd rather just say an illustration or a picture. But then if you have people who are really trained in things, I think Dad was right that sometimes the preacher was guessing, and I think he's wrong. Sometimes the preacher was not guessing. But Dad didn't know enough about it to know that it was a type. But I didn't tell him that at the time, you know. I had respect for the seat of my pants, you know. I wouldn't have told him that at the time, but he certainly woke me up on some of that. But don't over-type the thing. I know one lady said, "I like to type everything." Well, if you type everything, you just take away the power of the types that you use. And that's the first thing. It's a God-ordained illustration. And then we'll continue this after we have our break. All right, page 15.